Okay, Jeff. So in this session, we're going to talk about e-business suite and a particular risk that you've written about before, or a series of risks around profile options. So could you talk us through what you found related to profile options and why organizations running e-business suite need to take into account your findings?
Sure, absolutely. Well, there's kind of two threads in this area, Lewis. One would be access control risks, and then one is the configuration themselves related to profile options. So let me talk about access control just briefly, then we can talk about the configuration specific areas of risks within each profile option. So there's people think about when you're configuring profile options is the system profile values form, and that's found in the system administrator responsibility. That would be something that you'd expect an IT user to have access to. There they can set everything, so system level, responsibility level, application level, user level for the entire system. So that's one area that needs to be controlled. And as it relates to what we're going to talk about in the second half of this, which is really in around when you set them, what do? You have to think about whether you're getting the proper approval process, whether it should go through the change control process. Some things definitely should go through some things should go through change control, some things shouldn't. So having a governance process and then having the IT folks train on those the approval process and who the approvers are and what level should be set should be part of an overall governance procedure, if you will, related to managing profile options. Yeah. The other access control piece of this is the user profile values form. And the user profile values form is in a submenu such that typically most users, if not all users, will have access to be able to set the profile option for their user. Right. And so the complexity of profile options is you have something that's set at the user level, it overrides responsibility, application, and site level configuration. So you got to be really careful about, whether you're setting an exception, if you will, at the user level, and whether you should allow users to do that through the user profile values, or sometimes it's referred to as a personal profile values form. So that's kind of the access control risk.
Yep. Okay.
So getting into some specifics then, so profile options can do a wide variety of things relating to, password controls, something that's IT specific, to something like, I always like to use GLDI journal source, which is governing some risks in and around the journal approval workflow process. So they can be very specific and they can be very broad depending upon how they're set. Right. So just taking those two examples, and you can go through a couple other examples as well, but looking at specifically the password configurations, like sign-on and password length is a good example. The length of the password, you want to set that to match the policy for the organization. So sometimes an organization will have one policy, it's minimum 8 characters or 9 characters or 10, or sometimes there's maybe like 8 characters for end users and maybe a longer, like 12 or 15 for a system account or a service account. Yeah. So you might set the default value at the site level, so that let's say 8 at the site level, and then override that at the user level for specific service accounts at a higher level. So that's an example where on the IT side, you may have you may implement a policy with both a site level configuration or user level configuration. Right. But you can appreciate the fact that you can, if you can set it at the user level, you got to be cautious about whether or not it's appropriate given the policy. So if the policy says all users should be the same, then what you wouldn't want somebody to do is to override policy and set, like we have seen sysadmin, for example, which is ironic, but we've seen sysadmin at a lower level. So all users at 10, sysadmin at 8, or even things like the password days expiration was just at the user form level, kind of off track here a little bit, but that we've seen exceptions on some of the generic accounts.
Yeah.
So you have to be real cautious that the people that have access to that system profile values form, they know what the policy is, the overall governance for the organization. So they're not overriding policy or setting it inappropriately.
Yeah.
So when it comes to configuring profile options, we always say there's 4 questions to ask. Should it be set in production? In some cases, like we would argue that utilities diagnostics should not be ever set in production. It's not set by default. If it's going to be set up, it should be set to no. What level should it be set? It should be set at the site level. Who should approve that? Often, given the database security implications of that and potentially the audit implications of that, you would want either the CIO or CISO approving that if it was to be changed or set.
Yeah.
And then it should go through the change control process. That's the 4th question.
Right.
And one like utilities diagnostics should, but there's other things that are more kind of low risk and operational, like Java color scheme or the date format or other things like that may not necessarily need to go through the change control process.
And you mentioned a little bit of experience with things like password lengths and so on. But to take a step back, when you are working with eBusiness Suite customers, generally how aware are they of these issues with profile options? Is it fairly well known?
Not really. I mean, I think certain profile options, they would say, oh yeah, we get that we should have certain governance process or approvals related to those, but they really haven't thought through an overall strategy. They haven't documented a governance process. So we have a template we take customers through that says, of the profile options you set, let's at least agree upon what the governance process is related to those things. Let's first understand the risk. And then again, like, should it be set? Who should approve it being set? What level should it be set? Should it go through the change control process? Those are all decisions you have to make kind of profile option by profile option. So it's rare that we find people have that level of maturity. But when we kind of present the information to them, like, this is what you should be doing, and they're like, oh, okay, yeah, of course, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's a good example of something that is logical, but a lot of organizations just haven't got to the point where they've developed those governance processes.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit more about some of the areas around SQL and some of the issues we found there?
So there's 2, like SQL injection. So there's there's actually kind of one topic we can talk about related to profile options. So in some respects, so if you think about utilities diagnostics, in some ways, it's not SQL injection per se, but we're allowing people to manipulate data in a capacity of going through the back end, so to speak, of access, of looking at IDs within that. So kind of a segue, if you will, of that. In theory, you could use utility diagnostics to make changes to certain values in forms, like, for example, in the alerts form, the SQL statement that's associated with what happens when an alert gets triggered. You could manipulate that through utilities diagnostics. So that's another good example of profile options. But generally, we talk about the security risk related to SQL injection or SQL forms, or sometimes more recently, Oracle's referring to those as sensitive administrative pages and forms.
Yeah.
Those are objects at the application level that allow a user that has access to them to effectively have the same security as they would as having the apps login, which is the kind of the God role at the database level.
Okay.
And that's interesting enough. Like, it's well documented in the secure configuration guide. It's been out forever. We've been trying to track in that guide since around 2004 when it initially came out.
Right.
At least that's the first time we saw it.
Yeah.
And that's another big security vulnerability that organizations, I think, a lot for a lot of organizations haven't really thought through the implications of the access to those.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I want to talk about a example that's more business process oriented.
Right.
So this is the breadth of profile options, if you will. I mean, profile options have to be enabled to do personalizations. So that's another IT example.
Yeah.
There are ones that turn on log files or logging of user activity. So that's another example. But let's talk about GLDI journal source, which is really tied into the guts of a very important process in and around the journal approval workflow or the controls related to manual journal entries.
Yeah.
And Oracle, so Oracle provides the ability to upload spreadsheet-based journal entries. So that's a pretty common way of doing journal entry uploads for multiple systems. ERP Cloud has that. We've seen that in other systems as well.
Yeah.
So that accountants can build journal entries in the spreadsheet, and they can upload those without having to key those in the application itself. So it makes the development of journal entries much more efficient.
Yeah.
And in EBS by default, when you build that template, or even once the template's built, it's a macro-based template. You're defining what source it is. I'm calling it, which is what we refer to as a journal source.
Yeah.
A journal source is being used as part of that. So what you don't want, without going into a lot of detail of the why, but what we don't want is, you don't want somebody to be able to upload a source and make it look like it's coming from a subledger or from another system.
Right.
Most organizations, as they configure the sources, aren't going to have a source from the subledger or source from another system, like a payroll system, for example, go through the journal approval workflow.
Right.
So to the extent that they can bypass that by allowing, typically they allow some sources that don't go through the journal approval workflow. So somebody could create a spreadsheet journal entry, ADI journal entry, or GLDI is another reference, that references another source, like payables, for example, or payroll that's coming from Workday or some other system, that effectively would bypass the journal approval workflow process. And so what GLDI journal source does is it says to the system, if a journal entry is uploaded, if it's not the source that's defined in GLDI journal source, it needs to be rejected. Right. So we're making the assumption that all journal entries coming from spreadsheet sources have to go through the same controls as a manual journal entry.
Yeah.
And so the setting of that particular profile option, is a key to the integrity of the control design for the journal approval workflow that organizations will have. So that's like an uber critical profile option that would have a potentially significant impact on an external audit.
Yeah. And again, is that one fairly well adopted so far?
Yeah, I mean, that's one I would say we see more than 50% in external audits.
Okay.
I mean, frankly, there's an article I've written on that topic that's been out for 10 plus years, I'm guessing.
Yeah. So
we should see it 100% of the time, frankly, but we don't always see it. So, I mean, some organizations still have some risk in that area. And of course, there's a risk that you may set that and it may be changed or deleted as part of an audit period. And so you'd want to put a governance process. So whoever's, for some reason, some business analyst says it needs to be changed, they don't really have the authority to make that change or delete it. That should be something that like the CFO or the controller would sign off on. So that's an example where the approval really should be in the business process owner versus the example we talk about personalizations and utilities diagnostics should be an approver being within IT.
Yeah, makes sense.